I'm so excited and honored to speak today about my art. I've been coming to Wanderlust since it started back in 2009, I think, and always been teaching yoga. And so I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share this other great love of mine, which is art. So I actually was an artist before I became a yogini. I grew up painting. I went to undergrad and studied fine art at UC Berkeley. And around that time, around my junior year of college, I had a big life-altering experience. In the same week, I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease. One of my dearest friends committed suicide, and then I was in a car accident. All happened within a couple of days, actually. And this really was one of those cataclysmic shifts in my life. And what it did is it made me stop and reevaluate everything that I was doing. And it actually set me on my path with yoga. So I'm so actually grateful to that experience. I started practicing yoga around the time I was about 19 or 20, and it just saved my life. It was this safe refuge. It helped me heal my body, helped me heal my heart. Like so many of us have had that experience with yoga. So around that time, I sort of poured all my energy into learning about yoga. And as I started to look at the art world through the lens of now being a new yoga practitioner, I started to think that the art world now seemed to me pretty shallow and very narcissistic. And I really felt, because I'd had this this powerful experience in my own life, that I wanted to dedicate my life toward things that would be more uplifting to others, things that would be of service. And so I started to teach yoga. What was wonderful is that teaching yoga led me to India. And while in India, I realized that I didn't have to have art and yoga be separate. I saw through the culture of India that art can be very powerful and devotional and uplifting, and that actually the teachings of yoga can come through in an aesthetic presentation. So I wanted to start today with this image of Saraswati that I painted. She is the goddess of the arts and of music and of wisdom. And she's seen here floating on a lotus with her little pet swan, who is her protector animal, her vehicle. And she's carrying a mala, which she likes to chant mantras, and she's playing a veena. And in her hand is actually is how they used to write all their texts on little leaves, and they were held together, sewn together in little books. So it sometimes looks like a chocolate bar in her hand, but it's actually, great, wise text. And when I traveled to India and I saw all this beautiful iconography, and I saw that art was also woven in, and spirituality and devotion was woven into everyday life. I saw that in the shops they had little Ganeshas and Lakshmis for abundance. In the rickshaws they had, Hanumans and protectors, and the art and the devotion just was completely merged. So this was a huge revelation to me, and it helped me reunite these two great loves in my life. And I started to paint my own versions of the deities. So we can move ahead, and I'll just show you a few that came out around this time. There's a Ganesh, a dancing Ganesh, and Durga, the warrior goddess, and there's a floating Lakshmi with her elephants, and another seated Lakshmi. So I want to pause on this image for a moment. This is an interesting painting. I actually did this before I ever practiced yoga. On my very first trip to India, I was in a bookstore in Kathmandu, and I was just hanging out. I was, backpacking through Asia, and I opened it up and I started reading about this concept of Kundalini. And it just intrigued me, the way they describe this powerful latent energy that was in all our bodies, and it was stored at the base of the spine, and it was this great creative force. Well, this is all I read, just a few paragraphs. I went back to my little hostel, and I sketched this painting. When I went back to school, I painted her, and she's actually quite large. She's about 6 feet tall. And I started to this concept of Kundalini, this concept of creativity being in our bodies. And of course, they visualize it as a serpent energy. Just was this incredible image. I couldn't shake it, so I had to paint it, like a lot of things. And here she's almost pregnant with her creativity, right? She has this like pregnant belly, but there's a snake. It's kind of strange, but that's how art is sometimes. What I learned many, many years later in my exploration of yoga and art is that this creative energy, this Shakti, this Kundalini, is responsible for all the ways that we express ourselves. It's the animating force in our bodies, and it's the force that leads us toward our enlightenment. Right? It says when we wake up this Shakti, it starts to move through all the different channels and starts to purify all our different relationships until we reach the crown of the head and we're in union with the divine. So in further exploration of this, I found that there was some really useful tools that you can look at Kundalini Shakti as this one main force, but the yoga tradition is so wonderful, it actually refines it. So it breaks it down even further. And what I found is that there's 3 aspects of Shakti that can relate to our creativity. So there's Jnana Shakti, which is the goddess of intelligence. So it's this aspect of this energy that is the creative aspect of our intelligence. There is Kriya Shakti, which governs our senses. So the way we hear, the way we see, the way we touch. And there's Icha Shakti, which is our willpower. So it's said that these 3 different Shaktis have to weave together harmoniously in order for artistic expression to happen. So you need the intelligence behind it. Without the intelligence of a creative expression, it's sort of like we're just throwing up our emotions, or we're throwing up our experiences on people. They can be shallow and narcissistic and all those things that kind of turned me off about the art world initially. So we want to have a refined intelligence. And I started to compare this to the Yoga Sutras and think, oh, this is interesting. If I overlay these Shaktis with some of the other teachings in the Yoga Sutras, I can really start to use my yoga practice to enhance my creativity. So from the Yoga Sutras, we have this principle of svadhyaya, which is self-study. Some of you may be familiar with that, who've done teacher trainings. And this is really just a concept of it's important to look at ourselves. Journaling really helps. Reading sacred texts, it's just things that enliven and enlighten our minds to stimulate that higher intelligence. Things that kind of might take us down and dull our intelligence, and what I've experienced is when I let myself go completely crazy with bad media. Totally went through a phase addicted to People magazine and Us Weekly at the airports. Totally would have nights where I would just watch episode and episode and episode on Netflix and dull my senses, dull my intelligence a little bit. And I found that over the years there have been times of great creativity and times when the creativity has kind of trickled down to like barely there. Kriya Shakti is another form of this energy that we can play with. So she governs all our senses. When we want to bring out the creativity in our lives, we can do things that positively enhance our senses. So yoga is actually really good for that. Because when we're in yoga poses, we're breathing, we're feeling, we're focusing our eyes, right? We're looking at certain drishtis, and we're starting to refine the way we hear and see. So it's actually a powerful way to refine our senses. Some things that we might do that dull our senses is like anything that is an excess of the senses. Oversleeping, overeating, too much sex, drugs and alcohol. Too much of these things can dull our Kriya Shakti and can dull our creativity in general. So this relates to this concept in the Yoga Sutras of brahmacharya, which you may hear about, which just means moderation. So when we're moderate with our senses and we look to stimulate our senses in a positive way, then we'll enhance our creativity. And finally, I learned about Icha Shakti. Icha Shakti, this willpower. So when we have a creative inspiration, it's sort of like ephemeral. It's this vision we might have. We need Icha Shakti to manifest it, to pull it through into being. Right? It's that step from having a wonderful creative idea and then being able to actually make it happen. And this could be any kind of, it could be a painting, a book, a new business, a garden, a magnificent dinner party for all your friends. This could manifest in so many different ways. But without that Icha Shakti, it may just live in this dreamlike state. So Icha Shakti helps us to pull our creativity through. And again, I sort of overlaid it with the Yoga Sutras, and for me, Sangha was the most important thing to stimulate Icha Shakti. So Sangha is the people we hang out with. So I found out that if I was hanging out with really cool, creative manifestors, it just stimulated that within myself. So that would be my suggestion there from the yoga tradition of how to really cultivate your creativity. And then we'll go to some next slides. So along my journey, being a yogini and then an artist, I actually was visiting a friend and found a coffee table book about the Ajanta Caves in India. And I fell in love with this book. The Ajanta Caves are about 2,500 years old, and they're in Maharashtra in India. The caves themselves, this is sort of a view as you walk into the site, and you can just see these little openings. So the caves weren't naturally formed caves, they were actually carved out by hand into these cliffs. And when they were carved out, they brought in sculptors and painters to just fill them. So when you walk into the caves, there's giant Buddhas, and it's floor-to-ceiling paintings. The caves were created during a time when Buddhism was really flourishing in India. And in the Buddhist tradition, the monks weren't allowed to stay any place more than 3 days. They had to just keep moving. They thought if they stayed, they might, fall in love, want to have a job, want to, turn away from their monastic tradition. So they kept them moving, except during the monsoon season, when the rains made it impossible to travel at that pace. So during the 3 months of the heavy rains, the monks would gather together at these pilgrimage sites, and the Ajanta Caves was one of them. So it could house up to like 1,000 monks, and they would gather here and wait out the rains and do their practices and really be in community. If you think about them mostly wandering and doing their practice on their own, the Ajanta Caves were a place where they could really gather and connect and kind of be bolstered up in what they were doing. And let's go see a few more images of the caves inside the caves. So this was carved into the stone as they carved the caves, these beautiful sculptures. These are some of the paintings on the pillars. And this is like all the way up to the ceiling. You can see how they were beautifully painted with murals. That's me visiting the caves. And one of the monks, so there's lots of monks who still go visit the Ajanta Caves. Great. So these now, I'm going to pause here. These now are my interpretations of the paintings I saw in the caves. And the paintings in the caves mostly told the past lives of the Buddha when he was bodhisattva animals. So this is an incredible part of art history, really. It said these stories may have traveled, eventually became Aesop's fables and Canterbury tales. They were really the first stories that were about ethics and moral tales told from the perspective of animals. So in these stories, all the animals were more enlightened than the human beings, and they would teach the human beings qualities like devotion and patience and kindness and all these things. And it said that the Buddha himself taught with these stories. It was how he would relate to lay people, in talking about animals in simple stories to teach about kindness and compassion. So I wanted to tell you one of these stories because they're so beautiful. So this is a story of a golden luminous swan. Right? And this swan was legendary, and people spoke of him as this magnificent creature. Well, there was a nobleman who heard about the great swan and thought to himself, I want to possess this swan, right? All my rich friends have fancy animals. I want this majestic swan for myself. So he devised a plan to capture the swan. He created an enormous pool, filled it with luxurious lotus flowers to attract all the swans in the whole world. And so he built this huge, huge, beautiful, magical water garden. And sure enough, the swan community heard about it, and they're like, let's go check out this beautiful garden. So it said about 60,000 swans flocked to this water garden, including this great luminous golden swan, who is in fact a great Buddha, an enlightened being, and a great teacher. So the great golden swan and his student joined this flock of birds, and they all went to this magical garden. There was fountains and lotus flowers and rainbows and all this. And the nobleman waited, and when he saw the golden swan arrive, he hid in the bushes with his trap. And when he wasn't paying attention, he sprang his trap, and this great net flew out and wrapped around the leg of the golden swan. Well, in the commotion, almost all of the 60,000 other swans quickly you can imagine them flapping their wings and quickly escaping the scene. But the student of the golden swan stayed. And as the nobleman came out and was starting to rope in this beautiful creature, he said to his student, you haven't been captured. Go fly away to your freedom. And the student said, oh, master, I could never leave you. He said, a life of freedom without devotion would be pure hell for me. I would rather be captured alongside you and spend my days in a cage than to leave your side. So in these stories, the animals and the humans understand each other. The nobleman saw this happen, and his heart just broke open. He just instantly realized the error of his ways, and he set them both free, and he gave a big feast for them, and he thanked them for teaching him this great wisdom, and he vowed to never capture another animal again. So we'll move through a few of these slides of my versions of these bodhisattva animals from the Jataka tales. This is one of the first images of a bodhisattva ever in art history. They say these crowns that they wear was the first time that it appeared with these crowns, sort of signifying this is one of the loyal elephants, and his mother is another beautiful story. A patient ox, a princess, a mischievous monkey, and a golden Buddha. And then we'll stop on this image. So when I went to visit the caves, I had actually been studying these images from this coffee table book for almost a year, and had already started doing my own versions. So it was a really powerful experience to then go and visit the caves and see them in person. And they're very dark. I don't know. I think I heard to actually paint in there, they took mirrors, they took polished glass and bounced the light from outside the caves inside the caves so they could make these paintings because they're very dark. So when you go visit them, they're very dark. And they don't have lights on all the time because they don't want to deteriorate the paintings. So you go with a guide and he just has a flashlight and he quickly like across the wall. And of course I'm like, trying to get everything in my eyes in a few seconds. And as we walked through one of the caves, he flashed across this wall and I saw this big image of 1,000 little Buddhas all lined up like this. They all had different little hand gestures. They had similar robes, but they all had these unique little expressions on their face. And the image just was so powerful to see. It was almost a very graphic image. They were all so much the same, and yet they each had their own little personality. So later on, years later, this image would keep coming back to me and stuck in my imagination. So I went back to my books and I started to read about the story behind this image. So I'll share that story with you now. This is the story of 1,000 Buddhas. And it said when the Buddha was a young teacher, he had a very successful student who was a yogi. And this yogi student of the Buddha was extremely gifted. He was very strong. He was very intelligent. He could do all the handstands. He could float through his vinyasas, right? He was in all the spectaculars with his talents. And they would do competitions back then, and everybody would kind of show off their abilities that they had learned through yoga and meditation. And at one point, the student won a golden bowl for his prowess as a yogi. Well, he went to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha gathered his closest students around, and he said, I'm very proud of you all. You've done such hard work, and you've gained so many gifts and talents through the practice. But I want from now on for us to focus on being kind, compassionate people and not showing off with our skills as yogis. So he said, from now on, no more tricks, no more competitions, no more one-armed handstands, no more, floating in meditation, no more, bilocating yourself and mind reading and all these, special powers that came with doing yoga. And the students agreed and they said, you're right, teacher. It's really about being good people. So let's focus on that. Well, the word got out, and of course there was some skeptics out there. The Buddha, they were mad that the Buddha was teaching, and then he was getting all these students, and he was starting to get some notoriety. So they said, this Buddha, he is not a really enlightened being. He's telling his students this because actually he has no real power, right? So how convenient that he's telling them to just teach kindness. So he challenged the Buddha. And they had a big assembly. And the Buddha thought to himself, wow, I'm really in a predicament. I've told my students that we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't perform any kind of things that would be perceived as miracles. And yet, deep in my heart, I know that if I don't stand up right now and show my strength, that these teachings could be lost forever. So he came to the assembly. And all these skeptics were in the audience just looking at him, grumbling, they're gossiping. And the Buddha just sat there and became very, very still. Right? His eyes at that little half mast. And he pulled all his energy into like a single point in his being. And then from that point, in a holy instant, he just projected 1,000 exact replicas of himself into the audience. And everyone there just went, all the skeptics, just their jaws dropped and they looked around and they saw this incredible power of this enlightened being. And so this is this image that we see in the Ajanta Caves of 1,000 Buddhas. And then we can go on a little bit more, Karina. This was another one. So these ones I did back in 2006, and they're small. These were the first images. About 2 years ago, this image kept recurring, kept coming back, and I thought, I want to do my own version of this painting. So I got a big giant board, and I started to hand paint all these little Buddhas together. You can see I have some of them, in the different phases of painting them. They don't even have their little faces yet. There. So when I finished the first painting with 1,000 Buddhas, it took me almost a year to paint all those little hand-painted ones. Of course, we travel a lot, so I wasn't home for an entire year. But when I was, I would go to my studio and I would work on it. And it was quite a meditation, and through it I started to feel this connection to these Buddhist monks, their discipline, how they do things over and over and over again, the repetition. And, sometimes it would be so grounding to do this repetitive practice. And sometimes, to be quite honest, it would be boring. And I would sit there and I would play little games with myself like, okay, 10 more Buddhas and then you can go have lunch, And I felt like what it must be like to dedicate yourself to these practices and commit to, they do all kinds of they sit and they meditate for hours and hours, and then they write mantras 1,000,000 times, and they do all these different prostrations around mountains, repetitive. So it started to perk my curiosity about the tradition. So as I painted, I would listen to a lot of cool teachings about the Buddha. I listened to Robert Thurman's talks about Tibetan Buddhism, and I listened to Deepak Chopra's story of the Buddha, and I started to read more and educate myself about these practices. And at some point during the process of painting this one painting, I had one of those little intuitive voices. And as I came to complete this first 1,000 Buddhas, I kind of just heard this little voice say, keep going. You're not done yet. You have to do a lot more. You should probably do about 10,000. This number just kind of. And I was like, oh, okay. And I thought, well, I'm ready for this artistic sadhana. In my yoga practice, I realized I've probably done 200,000 sun salutations, in 20 years. I've probably done so many thousands and thousands of the same poses, of the same mantras, of the same meditations. And I sort of felt this calling to this now, to take this way of approaching a practice through my art. But I knew that if the first one took me over a year, that I would be very, very old to finish 10,000 at that pace. So I took some cues from my graffiti painting husband, and who, stenciling is one of the tools that graffiti writers use because, of course, they're painting illegally and they want to get in and out before they get caught. So they have pre-made stencils, they come in and do their art and then run. But I thought, this would be really cool to kind of bridge this street art, this Western, this illegal practice of way of writing graffiti, and this ancient, sacred practice of painting the Buddha. So I took a bunch of my drawings and I had them made into stencils. And I started this journey of painting 10,000 Buddhas. And so I'll let the slides roll for a little bit, and you can see all the different colors that came out, all the different little faces and the variety. Of course, we like to go visit any Buddhist temples we find on the way, different phases of their construction. I decided after I finished each one, I wanted to put a blessing on the back. So I read a copy of the Dhammapada, which is a beautiful Buddhist text, and I found these little gems. And so each painting has a blessing. This one is be selfless and joy will follow you like a shadow that never leaves you. This is which is so beautiful from the Buddhist tradition. If you find a friend who is good, wise, and loving, walk with them all the way. Such a beautiful teaching. So as I painted, sometimes I would, you can see some of the areas are wiped out. And this was because as I painted them, I started to kind of feel this realm of Buddhas in the room. And it would sort of shimmer, like they would come in and out. In the same way that when we meditate, we kind of come in and out of our practice. We come in and out of this awakened state. Sometimes things are clear, and then sometimes that clarity disappears behind the veil. This is just some of the close-ups so you can see, even if I tried to paint their faces exactly the same, they always came out different. And as I started to look at them, it's like all the different things we go through when we meditate. When we close our eyes, suddenly there's happiness and sadness and joy and confusion, bliss, and it started to like show up. So as I continue to sit with these, this image of 1,000 Buddhas and now 10,000, it's to me this this vision from the Buddhist tradition of that we all will eventually become enlightened. So they have this idea of being a bodhisattva. So once you gain your awareness, a bodhisattva, instead of choosing to go into a heavenly realm, chooses to be a servant to everyone else and keep coming back in multiple incarnations, maybe as enlightened animals or great teachers or just wonderful parents, and help everybody else to become enlightened. So this vision of 10,000 Buddhas is really a vision of us all as equals, a vision of us all rising up and evolving together through our practice. So I thank you for letting me share this with you today. So grateful to Karina and to Wanderlust. Namaste.